Miami, Florida. Palm trees, ocean air, and a room full of negotiators trying to put an end to a war that has reshaped Europe and rattled the world. But tonight, Moscow is warning against reading too much into it. The Kremlin says these talks are not a breakthrough, and it wants everyone to understand what comes next will be slow, technical, and uncertain. The message came from Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov in remarks reported by the Russian newspaper Izvestia and carried widely in international coverage. Peskov described the weekend meetings in Miami as a working process, not a turning point, and he signaled the discussions would continue in a meticulous expert format. Those Miami talks, held December 20 and December 21, brought together parallel tracks of diplomacy. According to U.S. officials met in Miami with Ukrainian and European counterparts on possible terms to end the war, while holding separate meetings with Kirill Dmitriev, a Kremlin envoy who also leads Russia's sovereign wealth fund. The U.S. side has portrayed the weekend as constructive. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff has described the discussions as productive and constructive, though even supporters of the process have not claimed a deal is in hand. The core disputes, including territory and security guarantees, remain where they have been for years: central, contentious, and politically explosive. And for the Kremlin, the tone matters almost as much as the substance. By calling it no breakthrough, Moscow is tamping down expectations, limiting the risk of political backlash at home, and keeping leverage in reserve. In diplomacy, labeling something a breakthrough can create pressure to deliver immediate results. Moscow, at least publicly, is resisting that pressure. There is another reason that language matters. When expectations soar, disappointment can harden positions. When expectations stay low, negotiators can keep talking even when the gaps are wide. That may be what the Kremlin is signaling. Keep the channel open, keep the process moving, but do not assume the big decisions have been made. On the Russian side, one immediate next step is a report back to President Vladimir Putin. Reported that Peskov said Kirill Dmitriev would brief Putin on U.S. proposals for a possible settlement as soon as he returned to Moscow from Miami. In other words, the Miami weekend was not the final round. It was part of a loop: talk, report, recalibrate, return. Ukraine, meanwhile, is also projecting cautious momentum. Reported President Volodymyr Zelensky saying negotiations with the United States and European nations were very close to a real result, while emphasizing that not everything is ideal and that there are still matters Ukraine is not prepared for, just as Russia has matters it is not prepared for. Zelensky has described the talks as centered on a U.S. proposed 20-point plan, a document that he said had been under discussion for weeks after an initial draft was criticized by Ukrainians and Europeans as too slanted toward Russia. That detail is important because it frames the Miami meetings as part of an evolving proposal, not a fixed take-it-or-leave-it offer. Even so, Zelensky has been clear on one point that has defined Ukraine's position throughout the war: security guarantees. In the report, he said security guarantees and a plan for economic recovery were under discussion, and he raised the question of whether the United States can obtain a real response from Russia that goes beyond continued aggression. So what do we actually know, as opposed to what is being hoped for? We know there were meetings in Miami. We know Washington says the conversations were constructive. We know the Kremlin says it is not a break. And we know both sides are now in the phase of internal briefings, where negotiators report to leaders, and leaders decide what flexibility, if any, they will authorize next. Beyond that, details are limited, and that is typical in sensitive negotiations. The most difficult points are often kept private until the last moment, precisely because premature disclosure can derail the process. But the broad categories of disagreement are not secret. Territory and security guarantees are the two big pillars, and around them sit issues like sanctions, reconstruction, prisoner questions, and the sequencing of any ceasefire. Here is the basic dilemma. Ukraine wants an end to the fighting without creating a pause that allows Russia to regroup and strike again later. Russia wants an end to the fighting on terms it can portray as securing its interests and validating the costs it has paid. The United States and European partners want a stop to large-scale war on the continent. But they also want an outcome that does not reward aggression in a way that destabilizes the wider security order. Peskov's remarks also pointed to a benchmark Moscow is using to judge U.S. proposals. Reported that Peskov said Russia would judge how far the ideas matched what he called the spirit of Anchorage. That reference points back to an earlier meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, in August, where, according to U.S. President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin, discussed possible parameters including territory and security guarantees and agreed to keep export channels open. The phrase spirit of Anchorage is doing a lot of work. It suggests Moscow believes there is an understanding, at least in broad outline, about the kinds of parameters that could be on the table. It also suggests Russia wants clarity on what the U.S. is coordinating with Europe and Ukraine, and whether that coordination aligns with what Moscow believes was discussed earlier. That point is critical because negotiations like these are not just about what the U.S. and Russia say to each other. They are also about alignment among allies. Ukraine has its red lines. European states have their security concerns. And Washington is trying to act as broker while also being a party with its own strategic goals. When Moscow says it wants details of Washington's work with Europeans and Ukrainians, it is saying, show us the full picture, not just a conversation in a room. Why Miami? The location itself is a signal. A U.S. city far from the front lines can serve as a controlled environment, with high security, and with the ability for American officials to manage multiple delegations in parallel. It also frames the U.S. as the central convening power. But it also has a risk. It can create the perception, fair or not, that the war's future is being discussed far from the people living through it. And there is another layer. Holding talks in the United States can make domestic politics unavoidable. Any proposal that emerges will have to survive scrutiny not only in Kiev and Moscow, but also in Washington and across European capitals. Public opinion, legislative bodies, and military planners all play roles. That is part of why leaders are careful with language now. No one wants to sell a deal that is not yet real. The Kremlin's no breakthrough line also reflects the realities on the ground. There is no ceasefire in place. Military operations continue. And as these talks unfolded, the war continued to intrude into the headlines, underscoring how far diplomacy still has to go. On Tuesday, December 23, Ukrainian officials said Russia launched an air attack on Kiev, with residents urged to remain in shelters until an all-clear was given. Early reports did not immediately detail the scale of damage or casualties, but the timing alone sent a message. Even with talks ongoing, the battlefield rhythm continues. In neighboring Poland, a NATO member, the spillover risk was also highlighted. Reported that Poland deployed its own and allied aircraft and placed air defense and radar systems on high alert after Russian airstrikes targeted western Ukraine near the Polish border. Those steps were described as preventive measures to safeguard Polish airspace. These episodes show the central contradiction of diplomacy in wartime. Negotiators can talk in conference rooms, but commanders and air defense units operate on a different clock. Even if diplomacy is moving forward, escalation on the ground can change political calculations overnight. A major strike, an unexpected battlefield shift, or a high-profile incident can narrow the space for compromise. That is why the word breakthrough matters. A breakthrough implies a clear shift, a ceasefire agreed, a framework signed, or at least a public commitment that changes realities. What we have instead is what diplomats often call process: meetings, drafts, consultations, and technical work. That can still be meaningful, but it is slower and it is vulnerable. So why does this moment still matter? Because even a process can reshape the next months of war. If both sides keep talking, it can reduce miscalculation. It can open channels for humanitarian measures. It can create a path, even if narrow, toward a pause in fighting. And it can signal to militaries, markets, and allies that the political track is active, which can influence decisions far beyond the negotiating table. There's also a strategic angle for Russia. By engaging in talks while maintaining military pressure, Moscow can attempt to strengthen its negotiating position. That does not mean a negotiated settlement is impossible. It means any settlement will likely be driven by a mixture of incentives and pressure, not goodwill. That is harsh, but it is how wars end more often than not. For Ukraine, the risk runs in the opposite direction. If talks produce a pause without credible guarantees, Ukraine fears it could face renewed assault later. That is why security guarantees keep coming up. Guarantees can take many forms in theory, but in practice they are difficult because they involve commitments that other states must be willing to honor, even under future political leadership. For the United States, Miami is also a test of brokerage. Can Washington craft a proposal that keeps Ukraine aligned, keeps key European partners aligned, and still offers Moscow terms it might accept? That is a tall order. And even if Washington can draft such a plan, acceptance depends on leaders whose interests and narratives are sharply opposed. Now consider the Kremlin's additional signal, beyond calling it no breakthrough. On December 22, reported that Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said Russia is ready to legally confirm, through an agreement, that it has no intention of attacking the European Union or NATO. The statement was reported by Russia's state news agency, RIA, and carried by. On its face, that kind of assurance might be read as an attempt to ease wider European fears and create space for de-escalation. But skeptics in Europe may argue that any legal language is only as strong as enforcement and trust has been shattered by years of war. Either way, in the context of Miami talks, such statements can be seen as part of a broader diplomatic posture, signaling willingness to put some things on paper while continuing to press for core objectives. And that brings us to the hardest part, what the two sides mean by peace. For some, peace means a complete end to fighting and a stable border. For others, it means a ceasefire that freezes the conflict without resolving it. For others still, it means a settlement that locks in political and territorial outcomes. These are not the same thing, and diplomacy often struggles when participants use the same word to mean different end states. In conflicts like this, the sequence matters as much as the destination. Does a ceasefire come first, followed by negotiations? Or do negotiations come first, followed by a ceasefire? Does territory get decided immediately or postponed? Do sanctions get lifted early as an incentive or late as a reward? Each sequencing choice shifts leverage, and that is why talks can drag on even when both sides say they want peace. In the report on Peskov, the Kremlin said its priority is to obtain details from the United States about Washington's work with Europeans and Ukrainians. That indicates Moscow does not want to negotiate in fragments. It wants to see the consolidated package, so it can decide what is acceptable and what is not. Ukraine, from its perspective, is signaling that the foundations of documents are forming, but the unresolved issues remain significant. Zelensky's remarks, as reported by, suggest a sense that basic blocks are ready, while acknowledging both sides still have matters they are not prepared to accept. That is why it would be a mistake to treat no breakthrough as failure. No breakthrough is, in many ways, normal at this stage. What would be more alarming would be a collapse in talks with no channel left. For now, both sides appear to be keeping the channel open, even as they manage expectations. Still, we should be clear-eyed. Even a continuing process does not guarantee an agreement. Negotiations can stall, restart, and stall again. They can be disrupted by battlefield events or political crises, and they can end with a narrow deal on one issue while leaving the bigger issues unresolved. There is also the question of who is actually at the table. The Miami structure, as described in reporting, appears to involve separate meetings rather than a single joint session of all parties. That can be useful because it lets the broker move between rooms, testing proposals and reducing direct confrontation. But it can also slow things down because misunderstandings are harder to correct when parties are not speaking directly. At the heart of all of this is the reality that war is not just a dispute between leaders. It is a clash of security perceptions, national identity narratives, and geopolitical alignment. Any deal would need to be durable enough to survive the next crisis, the next election, and the next shift in the battlefield. That is why guarantees and enforcement mechanisms matter and why they are so difficult to design. Think about what enforcement could mean. Would there be international monitors? Would there be demilitarized zones? Would there be phased withdrawals? Would there be limits on certain weapon systems? Each option carries risks. Monitors can be blocked. Demilitarized zones can be violated. Weapon limits can be reinterpreted. And enforcement can pull outside powers deeper into confrontation. And then there is the reconstruction question. Even if fighting stops, Ukraine will face immense rebuilding needs. Zelensky, according to, said economic recovery was part of the talks. But recovery is not just money. It is also security for investors, insurance for shipping, stability for energy grids, and confidence that any pause in fighting will hold. For Europe, the stakes include not only Ukraine's recovery, but also Europe's long-term defense posture. European states have increased defense planning around a more hostile security environment. Any settlement that leaves uncertainty could keep Europe on a heightened alert footing for years, with major budget and political implications. For Russia, sanctions and diplomatic isolation remain central factors. A settlement could potentially create paths for sanctions relief, but that depends on terms and compliance and on decisions by multiple governments. Moscow's interest in clarity about U.S. coordination with Europe may reflect the reality that even if Washington is willing to adjust, European capitals may not move in lockstep. For the United States, there is a strategic balance. Ending a major war can reduce risk and costs, but the terms matter for credibility with allies and for deterrence more broadly. That is why any plan has to be defensible, not only as a way to stop fighting, but also as a way to prevent the next crisis. Now zoom in on the human dimension, because it is easy for peace talks to become abstract. This war has displaced millions, damaged infrastructure, and created lasting trauma. A ceasefire could save lives quickly. But a flawed ceasefire could also entrench insecurity, leaving people living in uncertainty and leaving political anger that can reignite conflict later. This is also why information battles remain fierce. Each side is trying to shape the narrative. Who is being reasonable? Who is obstructing peace? Who is protecting civilians? Who is escalating? When the Kremlin says no breakthrough, it is also trying to set the narrative frame. If talks stall, Moscow can say it never promised a quick outcome. If talks progress, Moscow can present it as careful, deliberate statecraft. Ukraine's narrative focus, as reflected in Zelensky's comments, is readiness for real results but insistence on meaningful security and continued pressure on Russia. In his quoted remarks, he emphasized the importance of ongoing international pressure, including sanctions, as a way to persuade Moscow to move away from aggression. So what should we watch for next? First, the expert-level format that Peskov described. That means working groups, drafts, revisions, and more meetings. Often the first visible sign of progress is not a grand announcement, but a small agreement, a procedural step, an agreement on agenda, or a humanitarian measure. Second, watch for the shape of U.S. coordination with Europe. The Kremlin has explicitly said it wants details on that coordination. If Washington can keep Ukraine and key European states aligned behind a single negotiating posture, Moscow faces a clearer choice: accept or reject. If alignment fractures, negotiations can become a moving target. Watch the battlefield. The air attack on Kiev reported December 23, and the actions by Poland reported the same day underline how quickly military events can raise stakes and harden positions. A spike in strikes or a major incident can shift diplomacy from negotiation to crisis management. Fourth, watch for signals from Moscow after Dmitriev briefs Putin. Reported that Dmitriev would report on U.S. proposals on his return. What matters is not only what Putin says publicly, but whether Russia authorizes negotiators to explore trade-offs or whether it sticks to maximal positions. Fifth, watch Ukraine's internal politics. Any settlement will be scrutinized intensely inside Ukraine. Public resilience has been forged through years of war, and any perception of imposed concessions could provoke backlash. That does not mean Ukraine cannot compromise. It means leaders must be able to justify whatever is agreed as protecting the country's future. Sixth, watch European capitals. Europe's role is central because of geography, security, and economic ties. Even if Washington leads, European states will have to make decisions on sanctions, security support, and reconstruction assistance. Their unity or division will shape the negotiating landscape. And finally, watch the rhetoric. When language shifts from working process to framework, or from constructive to agreement in principle, that is when the story changes. We are not there yet. For now, the clearest headline is the one Moscow itself is trying to write. No breakthrough. Talks continue. That combination can sound underwhelming, but it is also the reality of how major wars often move toward an end, slowly, unevenly, and with long stretches where the most important developments happen behind closed doors. The next weeks will test whether Miami was a holding pattern, a genuine stepping stone, or simply a stage in a longer contest where diplomacy and military pressure run side by side. The Kremlin is telling the world not to expect miracles. Ukraine is saying the outlines of documents are taking shape, but key issues remain. Washington is signaling persistence. And while negotiators talk, civilians keep listening for air raid sirens. That is the brutal backdrop to every sentence exchanged in a hotel conference room. The question now is whether the process that continues after Miami can produce something more than process, a tangible step that reduces violence, builds confidence, and opens a path to a settlement that lasts. Until then, expect more diplomacy in parallel with more fighting. Expect more careful words, more guarded statements, and more emphasis on technical work. In this moment, the Kremlin's message is blunt. Do not call this a breakthrough. And negotiations still in motion with everything still on the table and nothing yet decided.